Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing. I am Tracy Rogers. In this episode, Water Knows the Way, Diaspora, Return, and the Sea, I am in conversation with Adjoa Armah. Adjoa is an artist and writer whose creative and research practice attends to the material, historical, and spiritual geographies linking Ghana, the UK, and the wider African diaspora. We speak about water as a boundary and a bridge, and about the sea as a holder of memory for those of us whose histories are shaped by rupture and return. Adjoa reflects on an archive she created based on the Ghanaian coast as a site of history and collective belonging, and on how sand, fort, and shoreline performances challenge dominant narratives of the past. Our reasoning moves between archives and coastlines, between diasporic yearning and the everyday lives of communities that live in the shadow of these forts. We consider what it means to think with Sankofa, to resist romantic or commodified versions of return, and to trust that water knows the way, even when home is everywhere and nowhere at once. This episode listens to the sea as ancestor and keeper of story, and to art and performance as methods for holding what cannot be fully counted, contained, or forgotten. Welcome to Saltwater Reasoning. I am really pleased to have with me today Adjoa. Thank you for joining me today on this reasoning.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Our conversation today is going to be about memory and saltwater. And I'm so pleased that you were able to make the time to sit with me today. I want to start by inviting you to ground us with whatever you feel called to for today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to start with some words from Adjoa Armah, of no relation, but he's someone that I've adopted as a kind of spiritual grandfather. So he's a writer that's very important for me to think with and to approach the world through or respond to. So this quote is from 2000 Seasons. We are not a people of yesterday. Do they ask how many single seasons we have flowed from our beginnings till now? We shall point them to the proper beginning of their counting. On a clear night, when the light of the moon is blighted the ancient woman and her 7 children, on such a night, tell them to go alone into the world. There, have them count first the 1, then the 7, and after the 7, all the other stars visible to their eyes alone. After that beginning, they will be ready for the sand. Let them seek the sea line. They will not have to ponder where to start. Have them count the sand. Let them count it grain from single grain. And after they have reached the end of their counting, we shall not ask them to number the raindrops in the ocean, but with the wisdom of the aftermath, have them ask us again how many seasons have flowed by since our people were unborn.
Why those words? You said no blood relation, but a guiding light and star.
Yeah.
Why those words?
I come back to them quite often in my thinking. So in my research, I'm very preoccupied or committed to the beach as a site of research, a site of feeling, a site of history, of contact, of return. And something I'm really interested in from the beach is sand and how we use sand, and what it refers to or represents, and the extent to which it relates to this notion of accounting. So how we can, how we number events, or the relationship between the qualitative and the quantitative, the impossibility of fully counting or accounting, in this shared history that I'm very committed to doing my small part in its excavation. So this quote, because of its reference to both the sea and the sand of the beach in terms of kind of this tension between the qualitative and the quantitative, the impossibility of ever fully being able to count or account for. And it helps me feel better in moments where I feel like I'm not doing enough.
Yes. When I heard it, just the vastness of our experience and of our connection, and it feels almost like this notion of the impossibility of understanding and holding all of it, married with that commitment to maintain that connection. And it has diasporic energy when I
Exactly.
hear about it. And you and I, we came into contact through some diasporic energy. We have a mutual contact at the library in Ghana. And so that connection reached out to me and wanted us to connect because you were trying to connect with the family members of the poet Kamal Braffett. And so, although you're in the UK from Ghana, I'm in Jamaica, and we have that Ghanaian connection. Maybe we can start by leaning into your work, who you are, and how do you approach the work that you do? How is that grounded in water and sand?
I'm an artist, an educator, a writer. I am in the final stages of writing a doctorate in fine art by practice at the Ruskin School of Art, which is part of the University of Oxford. In terms of my background, I have training as an anthropologist. So my training is in visual material anthropology, and I come to art practice through this background in understanding culture and peoples. In terms of my research, both my current research or the research I do from the beach or in response to water, which is so foundational to my art practice, I came to kind of by accident. So it's this exploration of return as a kind of a collective condition of the Black diaspora that I came through through my own experience of return as an individual who was born in Ghana, moved to the UK as a child, and went back to Ghana as an adult 10 years ago. So the first year that I returned to Ghana as an adult, I was completing my anthropology master's, and I was shooting quite a lot of film photography myself, and I was doing research into textiles. So what I was interested in was the kente-ness of kente. So I was interested in the essence of kente textiles and the way that label is applied to materials that have different craft or material lineages, but it all kind of gets subsumed under the header of kente, and it's has so much significance within diasporic self-conception or how members of the diaspora connect themselves to the continent and Ghana in particular. So I was interested in return and kind of diasporic relations and the materialities of it through my background in visual anthropology. But when I was writing that piece of work, I was shooting a lot on film photography. I ran out of film for my own photographs. So I went to a place called Tudu in Accra, which is the photo district. And I went there because I was just looking for film for my personal use. Didn't find any film, but I met photographers who told me that they'd been burning their negatives. And as someone who, a child of the diaspora who had this constant longing and this kind of what if and this kind of wanting to understand this place that I had thought myself to know very well, but it turned out that I didn't know very well at all. Hearing that there was this photographic history that was being destroyed really piqued my interest and my curiosity. And so I started asking the photographers I'd met if they had any material that hadn't been destroyed yet, if they would give me the negatives rather than destroy them. So kind of by accident, I started an archive called Saman Archive. So that's an archive of photographic negatives. It's about 100,000 negatives to
Wow.
date. Yeah, so that's like another huge responsibility. And I'd been collecting for a few months until I realized the weight of that responsibility and that it was more than my own curiosity or my own longing to know this place better, but it was a real resource that I should take seriously. But after just very casually hanging out at photo labs, meeting photographers and getting photo negatives from them, I decided to be more proactive and start traveling around Ghana. And at this time, I didn't even drive. So I would literally just get on a bus and go town to town and get off and speak to strangers and ask them if they knew any photographers that they could introduce me to. And I would ask photographers for negatives. And maybe 9.5 times out of 10, there wouldn't be any negatives. But 1 time out of 10, there would be negatives. And even
Yeah.
if there weren't negatives, I would always have conversations with photographers about their relationship to photography. But when I was doing this collecting, I started to map the country. So I had various routes of kind of like, okay, what's the most efficient way for me to cover ground in this
Yeah.
country so I can build this archive of photography? And one of these routes was the border to border route from Ivory Coast to Togo. So that route is about 330 miles or kilometers. I forget which unit of measurement. And after traveling that route several times, I realized that there were a lot of slave forts along this route. And I hadn't known this about Ghana. I hadn't known that in the bounds of what is now Ghana, there were more slave forts than anywhere else in the African continent. And this doesn't mean that most of our kin that were enslaved across the Atlantic were taken from Ghana, just that for various reasons, there were a lot of forts in Ghana. And I became very interested in this. And it, for me, felt like this, and because I was encountering these forts and I was visiting places like Cape Coast and Elmina, and then I'd learn about, okay, so there's another fort here, so I would go there. So then eventually I'd visited 30 forts. And this researching this history became kind of folded into my investment in the archive and how to build an archive and what it took to build an archive and kind of what it necessitated, the politics of it, the obligations, the responsibilities of it. So how I describe my art practice usually, or the research that now forms my doctorate, is that it is all the questions that emerged through my attempt to build an archive from the Ghanaian coast, that the contents of the archive, that the photographs in the archive didn't actually attend to these questions. So there was questions like, kind of, what do we owe one another? How do you narrate a history of violence? How do you describe these forts without turning the slave fort into a point of origin? What's the gap between how the state is narrating this history and what people need and want and long for when we return to these sites, and what propositions might be made towards these questions and ultimately towards relation? And something that I say quite often is, when I'm thinking from the coast and thinking from these various doors of no return, I'm really interested in finding a form of address that feels just as relevant to those that passed through the door of no return and those that didn't. Because I feel that quite often our forms of address are for kind of quote unquote one side, but there isn't two sides. It's all of us. Like, it is, yeah,
Yeah.
these spaces belong to all of us. And how do we find a form of address? And that is for all of us. And I'm was really interested in the language, the indigenous languages that were being used to describe the fort. So, for example, in Ga, the word for fort is Mon. In Fanti, which is my language, the word for fort is Aban. But these words are also used to describe like the state, or used to describe policing, or used to describe the prison system.
Yes.
So I was interested in the fort as a an edifice of power, an edifice of containment, and the way that the language associated with the fort spoke to certain continuity between the function of the fort and maybe like the function of a neo-colonial state, or kind of like the afterlives of this history. And I wanted to find a different way to think about what we shared and what we long for when we return to each other from these sites that didn't treat the fort as an origin or kind of the extent of what our relations could be. So I became really, because I was thinking about, and also Mon and Aban means stone house. So I was really interested in like the solidity of stone, thinking with that in relation to sand as a material, which is referential, which is composite, which is composed of fragments, and thinking that, okay, perhaps in the form and the materiality and the composition of sand, there might be a better way to narrate this history or write this history, to materialize it through the form of the exhibition, to even like stage performance, to think about publishing. So that's essentially my work, kind of refusing how the structure of the fort instructs us to relate to each other and history, and instead focusing on the materiality of the landscape around these structures, and also the communities that have had to live in kind of in the shadow of these structures for hundreds of years, and how people talk about how it is that their communities came to be in certain geographies. Because like when you speak to Ghanaians along the entire coast, and it's very ethnically diverse. So it's from like Anlo land, like Anlo Ever speaking people, to Nzima speaking people and Ga speaking people. It's always a story of movement, right? So it's never a story of kind of, oh, people have been here forever and ever. It's always, we came from here, and before that we were here, and before that we were here. And there are so many stories of resistance and kind of the will for a better life for ourselves. And these stories span the entire African continent. So I was really interested in how to build these stories that span the entire African continent, with stories that come from across the Atlantic, and kind of create something out of those fragments, rather than kind of this story that the edifice wants to tell about itself.
So, you said a little while ago, you said in essence or essentially, and I thought, essentially, there's so many layers of this work. And I feel like I want us to pause and kind of unpeel some of them. And there's so much here. I'm hearing the narrative around the state, the narrative around people, the narrative around the forts along the coast, and then how we understand and conceptualize return. The other thing that strikes me is also resisting the notion to romanticize this history that we have that's there. So I visited Elmina last October 2024, and one of the things that struck me about that visit was how the fort had become this, well, it is a tourist attraction, and being from the Caribbean diaspora, people have different ways of thinking about return. Some people don't even want to entertain the idea of return. Some people think it's a foolish notion, returning to what? Other people feel a strong connection to this ancestral home. And that connection doesn't necessarily mean repatriation to the home. And then some people take it there as well. So return means so many things to so many different people. And in your work, you're also talking about people who live in Ghana. And as you said, transitory people who come and they make their home on that coast. The tourism is either something they participate in, it's part of their living landscape. There's another colleague that I have on the reasoning, and she talks about the geographies of grief and how that shows up in in the Caribbean, how it shows up on the coast. There's so many elements. So I want us to unpack some of those. So I guess I wanted to start with return and ask you, what did you learn about how people conceptualize and think through return through your research? What are some of the things, what are some of the places that you are feeling moved intellectually, also viscerally and somatically when you think about return?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about return, I mean, I'm very interested in Sankofa, which is it's cited so often that sometimes it feels almost like, shallow is the wrong word. Sometimes it feels shallow to cite it, and I'll use that word because I've seen it used in very shallow ways.
So for the people who are listening to this and they haven't heard that term, maybe you can speak a little bit about Sankofa and what that means as a symbol and as a metaphor.
Yes. So it's an Akan word. It literally means return and get it. And within the kind of Akan system of symbols, Adinkra, it is represented by a bird craning its neck backwards to grab an egg on its back. Sometimes it's represented as a kind of a line of a heart. So as a term, it is very often used, not just in Ghana, but across the diaspora as a stand-in for returning to our ancestral past or collective past or the African continent and retrieving some knowledge to be able to move forward in more grounded ways. But I say I've seen it used quite shallowly because I think because the concept of return has been folded into capitalist logics. Sankofa as a term has also been folded into capitalist logics, right?
That's a great way to describe it. It really encompasses what I feel very uncomfortable with when I'm there.
So I think it becomes a stand-in for anything related to the African continent, regardless of the ethic or the values by which that relationship unfolds. But how I think is more relationally healthy or actually truer to what Sankofa means is to think of it as a kind of ethical, onto-epistemological concept that makes certain demands of us, right? So kind of it's very easy to think about Sankofa in relation to the tourism industry in Ghana because return becomes a merely geographic thing, right? You took a flight from the Caribbean, you came to Ghana, and that is an instance of return. But actually, what Sankofa asks us to do is to think about cycles, to think about continuity, to think about obligation, to think about what we owe to, like that egg that the bird is craning back to. What do we owe to younger generations? What do we owe to the future? What do we owe to the process of creation and co-creation? And I think it's very easy for all of these obligations that are an essential part of return, which is it's rhythmic, right? So return folded into capitalist logic is kind of trying to put a round peg into a square hole. The whole point of thinking with Sankofa is that we're thinking with cycles and we can't claim to be thinking with Sankofa and be very preoccupied with kind of capitalist accumulation and like a velocity of speed or like a unidirectionality of progress that capitalism demands of us, because that's not what Sankofa stands for or represents.
Love that. Love that. And I like the notion of return not having a physical dimension. You know, think that notion of return has been part of the cultural experience of many of us in the Caribbean. You know, my ancestors who couldn't, getting on a flight to go to the continent was just not something they could imagine. But this idea of connection and return, and the stories that we have maintained, right? And our relationship with the water. Like I have a great, great grandmother stories of her that's passed down a line about her going to the water. My mother's people are from a fishing village in South Trinidad called La Lune in a
bigger town called Moruga. And so growing up there were all these stories about her going by the water and saying that she was going to return home. And so that has passed down. So here is someone talking about the notion of return. And I know what that meant for me growing up, hearing those stories come through the lineage. So this idea of return doesn't necessarily have to be a physical one. In fact, because of those stories, and I feel it too in my father's family as well, there's a way in which the continent has been a part of our life, definitely from a epistemological way. It's been part of who we are. So I love that idea. And I think it becomes particularly pertinent now when there's so much talk around what reparations, could look like. And that reparations doesn't necessitate the presence of the perpetrator or even the descendants of the perpetrator. That a reparation is that reclaiming of, probably reclaiming of strength, reclaiming of narratives, reclaiming of myths, restoring how we see Africa, a pushback against how we've been taught to see Africa. So definitely separating it from those capitalist logics is something that's really important. I think it broadens the way that we could think about return as well.
I think so. I think it's very necessary to broaden the scope of what return can mean, and just actually allow the priority to be about our obligations to be one another rather than a relationship with a place necessarily, but it's just like we belong to one another. So how return is performed or takes shape or used should, I believe, center that
ethic
Yeah.
of care and trust and
Exactly.
relationality. And for you, return is also returning after leaving Ghana as a child. So that's a whole other dimension of diaspora. Other than that, different from my framing of return as well. So these thoughts are there. The other thing that fascinates me when you speak about your research is how serendipitous everything feels. And when we think about research and getting involved in knowledge generation that is a calling that feels natural, like you tell the story and it's just one thing rolling out into the other. How did you follow that thread? Was it organic? Did you feel like, what did you feel when you were following that thread?
I mean, it was very much organic. I mean, I told myself quite early in the process that as long as I followed questions truthfully, whatever the work looked like at the end, then it would have been good work and it would have been worth whatever sacrifices I'd made to get the work done. So yeah, just really committing to seeing what's in front of me and responding to what's in front of me, for better or worse, for all the heartbreak and hurt and disappointment that might entail at times. Because I think there've been moments in this research, as someone who loves Ghana and kind of feels a sense of responsibility for my role in how the nation is narrated, and for the nation to disappoint you and to be able to follow that disappointment and still ask questions rather than kind of feel bound to kind of launder reputations through the way you ask and respond to questions.
Yeah. It's that responsibility of truth telling
Exactly.
that could be heavy to carry as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You were talking about grief before, and grief is like a huge part of this research at the best of times. But when I'm thinking about sand, for example, and the idea that like every grain of sand used to be something bigger, right? So any grain of sand could have been a mountain at some point in history, and thinking about like the personal grief and how actually perhaps that fits within a series of concentric circles with the diasporic grief when we think about like our relationship to like to Mama Africa as a concept, or to texts like Lose Your Mother, and how like this diasporic loss is considered or felt as the loss of a mother.
What role do you think ancestral presence has or have had in your journey through this work? As you're moving through, you're collecting negatives, you are collecting stories, meeting with people. Were you aware of ancestral presence? Is this something that you think that was implicated in your journey?
I think it is something that's been implicated in my journey. I mean, the first thing is that the archive of photographic negatives that I've built is called Saman Archive. Saman Archive is an Akan word for ghost, and the archive is called Saman Archive because Saman is the word that would be used instead of negative to describe the photographic negative. And that's not just the case in Akan languages. In Ga, I think it's Sisa in Ga, which is also the word for ghost. In Ewe, it's Ngoli or Luho, so it's the word for ghost or the word for shadow. So I was very interested in this presence in building an archive, and how thinking with the ghost as a co-conspirator in archival practice, what that could add to the kind of institution I could build by really taking this presence seriously. So I've always been very interested in the ghost as a figure. I think over the last 10 years, I've become more spiritually astute. I've been forced to be able to pay attention to what's going on in space. It's pointed to the idea of like following questions truthfully and fully. Me being that way inclined, or maybe tuning my antenna towards certain presences, that in itself, I think, has pointed out certain sites that require more prodding.
Yeah, I asked because, and I actively work with somatics as data, feelings as data, ancestral lineage and presence as data, and how they show up. So my training is in social sciences, but I try to make sense of my data with art making, and I'm very much aware that when I'm analyzing data, when I am making sense of data, that what I'm using, some of it is in my awareness and a lot of it is beneath that awareness as well. So I'm very interested too in how, when I create a piece of artwork, how what I created is just the lineage of the energies that came before me. And so when it's on the canvas, I then ask myself, what are they saying to me? Which becomes really interesting when you want to write research papers. But I do look at it as a form of methodological refusal. And so when I think about how anti-coloniality comes into my work, decoloniality comes into my work, it is refusing to box myself in, to look at data a certain way. And hence the question. So I'm really like, when you talk about it, just the serendipity of the journey, and the things that are happening, and you go, oh, but all of these things are happening, and here I am. And so I'm fascinated by that. So I'm hearing you understanding or making sense of that presence and what that presence looks like. And ultimately, your research goes to performance, and performance is a huge part of that work. One of the things that comes out really clearly when you speak is your ethic of responsibility and care as a researcher, and just a responsibility for the work to be in community and engaging with community. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about how your research enters performance and how it invites and co-conspires with community.
Thank you for that question. Before I attend to performance and community in my research and practice, I just want to respond to what you were saying before, because there's a text, but it's in the Funambulist. I think it's between Alexis Pauline Gums and Christina Sharp, and it's called there's salt in the title, but there's a quote in there that I really love, and I think they're actually citing someone else, and it's, "The things you know that you don't know how you know are real." And that is very important to me. And the call to trust yourself. And that's also something I love about sand as a material, because you have a tiny grain of sand, like in your underwear, because you went to the beach and it kind of stuck to you without realizing, but you feel the thing is there, right? And so I'm really interested in, okay, this tiny thing that is kind of like niggling at you, it's there. Like you didn't make that up. There's something there and you should follow that something.
Yeah. Thanks for pausing there and taking us back there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's a great conversation. But in terms of my relationship with performance and community, there's a text by a Senegalese philosopher, and that was translated by, I used to work at After All Journal, and one of my colleagues, an editor there, translated from French into English a text by Mamusé Diane on the logics of oral history a couple of years ago. And in that text, he writes about dramatization and the importance of dramatization within oral cultures and the kind of pedagogical support that dramatization provides within oral cultures. But that text is very important to how I think about how to work with oral cultures, how information should be passed on, and how that informs the shape that my community engagement takes. And also the shape that I do this research, I gather this data, and then it's formed or kind of crafted in my body, and it appears as performance or as certain words. And the words are like a mixing of my own writing, but also fragments of other texts. So it's also referential, because I want the words that I'm reciting to have a sensibility of sand. So it should be referential and kind of point to a bigger thing. It should be a bunch of things coming together to form a shore. But in terms of the performative work I've been doing along the Ghanaian coast, a big part of my research was doing oral history interviews. And when I decided that I wanted to do these oral history interviews of 5 key communities along the Ghanaian coast that have or had slave forts. So that is Osu, which has Fort Christianborg, which actually used to be the seat of government for over 100 years, from the colonial period through independence, through military rule, through democratic rule. That was the seat of government. It also was a slave fort before all of that. So there's Osu, there is Elmina, which is like very important in the tourist economy. There is Ada, had a fort, but the coastal erosion took the fort away. So there's no fort, there's just a memory of the fort. And also the community is called Adafwa, and the Fwa is basically it's fort. It's fort being pronounced in the local community, which becomes fort. So in the name of the community, there's the memory of the fort, even though the fort is no longer there. And then there's Keta, which the fort used to be in the center of the town, and Keta used to be the capital of the region. The capital was moved partly because of the coastal erosion, and the fort that was once in the center of the town is now right by the water, and I think about 2/3 of the fort has been lost to the sea. Now there are sea defenses, so there is some protection. And what I was interested in about Keta is that the story about how people came to be in Keta that is repeated and taught in schools, there there is some archaeological argument that actually that story was at least partially invented by German missionaries to make the process of colonizing the area easier. So a story which is like so important to people's self-conception is a fabrication in the interest of someone who doesn't have your best interest at heart. So I was really interested in that about Quetta. And then there is Cape Three Points, which doesn't have a fort, but it's the closest place on land to quote unquote nowhere, which is 0 longitude, 0 latitude. I mean, nowhere is an interesting place because it's called Null Island. It's really important for defense contractors and GPS. And when you upload images to the internet and you don't give it a proper location, it ends up in nowhere. So it's a very interesting geographic place. It also happens to have within like a 20-mile radius 4 other forts. And also because it's the southernmost tip of West Africa, there's a lighthouse there. It's very important in terms of wayfaring and navigation. So these are the 5 sites and kind of how I'm writing from those sites. So yes, Cape Three Points, Elmina, Osu, Ada, and Quetta. And all of these communities have different languages spoken. In Elmina and Cape Three Points, for example, they are both Akan languages, so there are some similarities. But for example, Elmina and Quetta are not mutually intelligible, like they're different language families. So I was interested in kind of the diversity of experience, of language, even like thinking through how do indigeneity and Blackness function differently in these communities along the Ghanaian coast. I was very interested in, but I wanted to do oral history research in each of these communities to understand the stories that the community had been passing down about itself, and also how each community was relating to the story of the fort and the role of the fort in the geography. So in each of those communities, there are sound works being produced kind of through a mix of the oral history interviews from the community and then translations of poetry from the Diaspora into local languages, and then fragments of my own text to just create a space to experience history narrated differently, or to maybe even just like re-enchant your own context and create something that just piques your interest. And it's just like, okay, this is something different.
That's beautiful. You said re-enchant your own context. I love it. So really making this thing that feels really everyday and ordinary a little magical.
Exactly. So there's that, which is one side, and then there's the performances, like how I place my body into the space. So there's a series of walking performances right on the shoreline, and takes different shapes because I get invited to do performances in institutions. So at institutions it looks a bit different, but in community and what that looks like, or what that has looked like so far, there are other ideas that I want to test out, but what that has looked like so far is these walking performances right on the shoreline, doing a series of 77 laps. And I choose the number 77, even like the Orisha Yemoja, in Yoruba, the Orisha of the sea, her number is 7. Within the context of like my ethnic group, the Ghanaian coast, for example, every Fanti ethnic group, it's thought that there are 77 shrines in the traditional Fanti area, or in like any traditional, in like the traditional Cape Coast area, there would be 77 deities and 77 shrines. So when you're pouring libations, you pour libations to 77. But the number 77 is also a stand-in for the infinite. So I'm interested in like a concrete number being a stand-in for the infinite, and even thinking about sand and accounting and kind of the relationship between the concrete number that is also potentially like infinite. So I do these 77 laps, and then while I'm doing these 77 lapse. I haven't been able to embody the writing to the extent that I can recite it from memory, but I have various sets of 77 fragments. So this includes my own writing, people like Glisson, like the Black Beach from Poetics of Relation, text from Dion Brand from A Map to the Door of No Return, text from Tadia Hartman from Lose Your Mother, just like a text from Adjoa Armah, fragments of speech from the elders that I've spoken to along the coast. So there are 77 of these fragments. And as I do 77 laps, I am reciting these 77 fragments. When I stage versions of these performances to institutions, for example, I did one with the invitation of an institution called If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution, something called Tidal Gatherings, curated by curator Chandra Frank. For that, there's an accompanying book, like a kind of a booklet. So the performance gets folded into this kind of micro publishing exercise. So then the text functions almost as a research compendium and stage instructions and a list of citations. So I'm really interested in this relationship between the written word and published text and kind of collapsing the authority or rethinking the asymmetries between the value ascribed to spoken words and printed words and recorded words and how those things can all be in relation. But when I stage these performances on the beach, because I'm right on the shoreline, at the end of this durational process of making these 77 laps in the hot sun, I finish, but there's a remnant of maybe less than half of the path I have made, right? So usually you make a path in sand. There's something left after you've made that path 77 times, that when you make that path as the tide is coming in and out, the tide wipes away significant amounts of what you've done. And I'm really interested in that. Again, thinking about impossibility, thinking about conditions of return, and thinking about what it is to try and do historical work and kind of do ancestral work and kind of enact the ethic of Sankofa under conditions where more powerful forces than you are wiping out what has gone before you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so there's community engagement. You're doing collaborative research. You're leaving something in the community as an act of service as well. So it's action research, it's collaborative, it's ancestral work, it's performance, it's art making, just multiple levels of that work. And there must be easier ways to get a PhD.
Much easier ways to get here.
There are, yeah. But I get that, and I get that. I really do. And it takes a lot more to do collaborative work and work that's really truly collaborative. And you said something so powerful that stuck with me. Regardless of what happens, you know you have done something, even though those powerful forces come up and wash things away. There's something that you have planted in the community. So I guess I want to ask a question, especially for students who might be in a similar process, either in the doctoral program or perhaps they're doing postgraduate work. What keeps you motivated to persevere through it?
I feel like I don't have a good answer. I feel like stubbornness is what keeps me motivated.
Listen, I am pretty sure that bad mind helped me write my dissertation. And Trinidad bad mind is when you know they have energies out there that don't want you to finish this. And so you write a chapter. So much of my dissertation was written out of pure bad mind. So I get that. Refusal.
Exactly.
I get that. Definitely a strong commitment. It feels like when you talk about your work, it feels so large. I don't know if you feel that, like from this side looking at your work, the largeness of it is inescapable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It feels very large to me as well. And at some point, that was something that frightened me. It
Yeah.
doesn't frighten me now because I don't feel the need to do everything. I just need to try my best to do enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. So when you originally reached out to me, you were trying to translate a poem by Kamal Braffett, and you wanted to make sure that you got permission from the estate. And it's so funny because to me, that and all is a form of return. Here you are doing this performance work on the Ghanaian coast with, people who live in these villages, some of whom have no connection with the history of the coast, but collecting their history and their stories. And here you are reaching for this Barbadian poet who's done so much beautiful work. So if you could tell me a little bit about that poem, why you were drawn to it, and how has it been included in your work?
Yeah. What I was drawn to with the poem is I read the poem maybe 10 years ago, so I've known the poem for a while, hadn't thought about it for several years perhaps. So I returned to, and also I usually I listen to him. I love the timbre of his voice. So I listen to him. And there's actually one poem that I adore, Eating the Dead. And there's a recording of Eating the Dead and Negus together. So I was having this kind of emo moment listening to Eating the Dead, and then I let it run for too long, and then I was reminded that this poem existed, and it was everything that that I needed to hear. And I thought perhaps other people would benefit from hearing, and I really wanted to make it available within the context of a certain community and to feel close to hand. Because I think, Ghana is an English speaking country. A lot of people speak English, but English is still distancing, right? So I wanted to find a way of making this poem closer to hand, as part of these works that I'm making for the information centers.
Yeah. So you're translating the poem now.
Exactly. Yes. It's translated into Ewe now.
What a great way to think about ancestral energy and legacy, and the way in which we keep learning from those who have gone before. So I want to invite you as we close to share Braffett's poem with us, and for us to end on that note.
Love. So thank you very much for your time and your conversation, and just for making the effort to listen to me. It's been a pleasure.
Your work is so fascinating. I am very grateful that our paths cross. I've been thinking about doing this Saltwater series for a long time. It's been coming soon for a number of years. And when we made that connection and there was a blurb about your work, I was like, oh, so I'm thanking you because that gave me this boost to do it now, because I've been putting it off for a long time. So for me, this feels really fitting. And maybe that falls in with the serendipity that we've been talking about, and trusting the guidance that comes, how it comes. So thank you. Thank you for sharing this work. I'm looking forward to its, I won't say completion, right? But to the pause that comes, that brings the end of the dissertation. But your work feels like lifelong work, which is really what doctoral work is supposed to be. It's supposed to be that work that now starts you on a path to continue building. And so it's beautiful and powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read Negus. It It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not enough. It is not enough to be free of the red, white, and blue, of the dragon. It is not. It is not. It is not enough. It is not enough to be free of the whips, principalities, and powers. Where is your kingdom of the word? It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not. It is not enough. It is not enough to be free of malarial fevers, fear of the hurricane, fear of invasions, crops, drought, fires, blisters upon the cane. It is not enough to tinkle to work on a bicycle bell when hell crackles and burns in the 14-inch screen of the Japanese constructed, United Fruit Company imported, hard sell telltale television set, rhinocerously knobbed, cancerously tubed. It is not enough to be able to fly to Miami, structure skyscrapers, excavate the moon-scaped seashore sands to build hotels, casinos, sepulchres. It is not enough. It is not enough to be free to bulldoze God's squatters from their tombs, from their relics, from their tombs of drums. It is not enough to pray to Barclays bankers on the telephone, to Jesus Christ by shortwave radio, to the United States Marine by rattling your hip bones. I must be given words to shape my name to the syllables of trees. I must be given words to refashion futures like a healer's hand. I must be given words so that the bees in my blood's buzzing brain of memory will make flowers, will make flocks of birds, will make sky, will make heaven, the heaven open to the thunderstone and the volcano and the unfolding land. It is not enough to be pause, to be whole, to be void, to be silent, to be semicolon, to be semi-colony. Fling me the stone that will confound the void. Find me the rage, and I will raise the colony. Fill me with words, and I will blind your God. Atibon, legba. Atibon, legba. Ovri baye pour moi. Ovri baye pour moi.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sheo.
You have been listening to Saltwater Reasonings, where we sit with the currents of care, struggle, and knowing otherwise. My deep thanks to Adjoa Armah for this generous and layered reasoning. Her work along the Ghanaian coast invites us to rethink forts, sand, and sea, and to attend to the ghosts, archives, and communities living with the afterlives of empire. We have touched on diaspora and return, on Sankofa as an ethic of responsibility, on grief as part of our intellectual and spiritual work, and on performance as a way to re-enchant familiar landscapes. To learn more about Adjoa's work and to find links to the archive, readings, and related resources, you can visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Thank you for listening, and I invite you to join me for the next tide in this series as we continue to reason across the waters, disciplines, and geographies of resistance. Until then, may your listening be spacious, and may the sea meet you with the memory you need.